as kids, we just kind of wanted to sound brutal and have our friends flip out when we played it live.
Welcome to the Dreams of Consciousness podcast. If you'd be so kind, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, I'm Adam Biggs. I play bass and do vocals in a band called Rivers of Nihil.
And Adam, how would you describe the music of Rivers of Nihil?
Yeah, I guess if I had to, pin the tail on the proverbial genre donkey, I would say progressive death metal is probably most apt lane to put it into, but I try not to think about it too much, I guess. Yeah, I would just describe it as, it's heavy metal music that a few guys from Reading, Pennsylvania try really hard to make sound as cool as they can.
Now, in terms of the progressive side of your sound, would you say a lot of that is the way that you guys integrate different influences and maybe different instrumentation that people don't usually associate with metal?
Yeah, yeah. I think there's it's interesting to always like put two things together that kind of rub against the grain, perhaps. And yeah, we definitely explore like metal can just be kind of narrow. I don't really mean any offense by that, but it can be just a pretty narrow genre. Kind of one attitude and one sound. With some slight variations across the board, but which is fine. Like I think I grew up loving that kind of thing, but I don't know. I felt like I always wanted my band to challenge that in a way and try and acknowledge other musical things in our lives that are important that aren't just based in heavy metal music.
For people who aren't familiar with Rivers of Nile, can you tell me a little bit about the history of the band and what your intentions were when you first started?
Okay, so the beginning of the band, it was we were formed in 2009. It was kind of out of the bones of a couple other local projects the members had at the time, the original members. We kind of squashed these things together and became this band called Rivers of Nile. And, we played as many local shows as we could possibly make it out to on a weekend and or a long weekend if we play as often as we possibly could as a really young band and had this more death metal kind of sound, maybe even deathcore kind of sound going on. There's lots of focus on breakdowns and blast beats and like playing really fast, which is yeah, it was gratifying at the time and really fun. But we always kind of try to like take one step out, maybe introduce something that put us into a class of just broader musicianship that doesn't apply to metal. And so like as by challenging ourselves as musicians over time, like we kind of branched out into adding a bunch of different sonic elements to the band and yeah, just over the course of writing now 4 full-length records, I feel like we've tried a lot of different things.
So that first EP, Hierarchy, was recently re-released. How do you feel it represents the band now? And how do you feel about the EP in general?
It feels, I mean, it's definitely interesting to listen to and a fun artifact, and like the songs just taken on their own are, they're brutal and a lot of fun because that's what we did as kids. We just kind of wanted to sound brutal and have our friends flip out when we played it live. But it feels so different than what we do now. Like it's just the emphasis on melody that exists in the music we make now, and the sort of the tighter musicianship and riffing and the economy of songwriting has changed, so much. It's just become so much more musical that it almost feels like a different band made that. And in a lot of ways, obviously, with member changes and all of that, that there's some merit to it, but it's still part of the thread of what makes us us.
Sure. Can you tell me a little bit about your songwriting? How does it usually start for you?
Well, I mean, we start usually with maybe the bones of an idea that Brody, generally it's Brody makes will like demo out some like a riff or two, like a small snippet of something, and he'll like get a bunch of these together, and we'll all kind of review them and like kind of point out like, oh, this one's cool. This I could see this going this way or that way, and a lot of it is Brody tinkering with things on his own. Sometimes he'll write an entire song just on his own, but a lot of times the beginnings of these things are like, this is how we do it. We just kind of pick these small pieces that we can kind of build off of and see what can become something bigger, and then we develop it as as individuals, as we start putting our hands on it, and we'll respond to what each other does. And once it comes studio time, and then at the end of that, we put all the vocals together, like, which is I start writing once we have a pretty finished version of the instrumental around, but I keep it kind of like stored in my head until like the last second, and then I sort of I've a lot of it that I'll write out onto I'll write it out for the first time like the day I write it in the studio. I keep it mostly stored in my head.
Sure. Does Brody demo stuff on like a DAW with like temp drums or anything like that?
Yeah, oh yeah, his setup is pretty sophisticated. He's got all sorts of studio wizardry knowledge that stuff of like the he knows the nuts and bolts of how to put a song together in a DAW really well, in a way that the rest of the band does not. So he has his hand on the wheel of the songwriting process for the most part. Outside of the lyrics and the vocals, which are mainly my responsibility.
And you recently took over lead vocals. Had you been doing backup vocals before that?
Yeah. I've always been involved in the lyric writing and the overall vocal makeup of the band pretty intimately. Kind of, I've written a ton of the lyrics for the band, and sometimes with Jake, and sometimes songs were just him, but I was responsible for a lot of the material. And yeah, so I would naturally just find I know I always had done vocals. Like Brody and I were in a band together previous to this, and I was like the lead vocalist for a while. Yeah, so I just always had a kind of a knack for doing that and writing the lyrics, and like I had an interest for it, and a lot of people won't touch it. So yeah, and taking over that role now as the vocalist, like now that in a time where we needed it, felt like a pretty natural solution, I guess.
Was there ever a discussion about getting another lead vocalist, or was everybody pretty satisfied with you taking over that slot?
Well, yeah, I really kind of wanted to explore potential other vocalists. I like we'd almost hired somebody for a fill-in spot on a European tour that we did, but I ended up just doing that myself, and that's kind of what did it. I think everybody else in the band just really liked the feeling of it being like a four-piece band, and they thought I was doing a good job on the vocal side of things, so it seemed like a natural way to do it. Instead of bringing somebody from the outside who we don't know maybe necessarily, because we couldn't think of anybody like immediately where we were like, yeah, that's the guy, like let's get him. Like we didn't really have anything like that. So yeah, we didn't want to just bring some other new guy that we didn't know and adopt all of his problems potentially, and a whole other person. That's a tough thing to do. So we felt like this was the most pragmatic way to go about it.
Cause they don't
So at the end of May, you guys will be releasing your fifth album, which is self-titled, through Metal Blade Records. Tell me a little bit about the album Rivers of Nihil. Tell me about the songwriting process and what you guys set out to accomplish with this album.
Well, yeah, it's a lot of what I, songwriting wise, like the process, like it was a lot of what I described earlier. Is that we didn't really change much about our general process, but having Andy in the band now, as being as a great musician, and especially as a vocalist, having his vocal ability on hand, I think kind of morphed the songs into catering towards that, which is was something I found really fun to work with. So yeah, we had that in mind, and also the just the overall change in makeup of the band, kind of being able to show us, just kind of just doing it to show like what we can still do like this. We can still achieve as much as big a sound as ever, maybe bigger. And so that was a good way to stamp the self-titled. I thought felt like a good time to stamp the self-titled thing on this and be like, this is who we are.
So you guys released a couple of singles, some of which are on the album before the actual album. Were those songs part of the larger songwriting process for the album, or were you guys writing songs by yourselves and separate to what the album became?
Well, it's interesting because when we started doing it, like writing these songs, we just were like, we want to get some music out there as this band, like as soon as possible. We just felt like it was we wanted to show everybody what we could do. So we took songs that I think would have probably landed on and did land on an album just in our general process, and we just decided to start pushing them out a little earlier, just to break everybody into the new style. I feel like, and we hadn't decided whether or not, like, I mean, initially, like some of those songs we hadn't decided whether or not they would make it on the record, but I think having like Suborbital Blues and Criminals are good enough songs, that I feel like they deserved a place on the record. So yeah, it felt like the right thing to include them.
Are the recorded versions of those songs, Suborbital Blues and Criminals, the same as what we hear on the album, or did you guys re-record those?
We didn't re-record them, we remixed them generally. We added a few things here and there, some detail work, and I think we kind of remolded them to fit on the album as a whole a little better, but without altering them too much.
Is this a concept album? Is there a narrative tying the whole album together?
I wouldn't call it like a narrative in that way. Like it's not like a concept record where like it's a beginning, middle, and end kind of story. It's more like the songs I feel all fit together in a general sort of theme, but they're about different things. And it's there's a lot of sort of about like maybe an emotional, spiritual journey in a person's life, and when you just take a look around at the world around you, and just kind of think about what do I really believe in, and that's like, I think that's the journey that the record kind of tells. It's a lot about belief, and it's a lot about skepticism and paranoia, and fear of the world around you, maybe justified, maybe not. But overall, all that heavy kind of concept, and it's also about like wanting to do the right thing, and be better in the face of all of that. But that amongst all of that, it's like it really is just like I just wanted the record to be heavy and fun, and like the lyrics are kind of they kind of shift in tone a lot. Like sometimes it is just fun, but it does, like, it sticks with that more moral principle, I think, and that's what makes it a concept record, quote unquote. rather than a whole story.
Sure. Where did you guys record the album?
We did it in Lidditz, Pennsylvania, at a studio called Atrium Audio with Grant McFarlane and Carson Slovak, behind the mixing desk for us. Yeah, it's our fourth record we've done with them. We also did that Hierarchy EP back in the day with Carson. So we've been working with some version of this studio and these guys for a very long time.
Why do you think the relationship has worked out as well as it has, as long as it has? And
Well,
what do you think Carson and Grant bring to your sound?
well, they definitely bring an openness. Like they're never, I feel like they're never going to like take one of our ideas and put it down. like whereas maybe some other producers may and have in the past thought, because we just like to go for it in the studio, and I think Carson and Grant really embody that. Like we could come up with some wacky idea, and they're dying to see it happen just as much as we are. And their response to our ideas and the way that they bring them to life is really like creates a really good workflow. You never get. I feel like I'm very rarely overwhelmed in the studio. Like those guys, make it really easy to see your visions come to life. I feel like working with Grant in a vocal booth is like it's a lot of fun. Like I had a blast tracking the vocals for this record. So I think that's and like they just happen to be right down the road from us. Where the band kind of resides in Pennsylvania. So it could doesn't really it almost doesn't make sense for us to go other places.
In addition to his role as an engineer, Grant also has played cello for you guys on your albums.
Yeah, and that's what I'm talking about. Is the kind of thing. It's like we're sitting around and like we're just like kind of throwing ideas around and like I we all know that Grant can play cello. He's amazing at it. And so we were just hearing parts that on that record that we think might need string, like could benefit from having a stringed instrument like that. And we'll just be like, "Hey Grant, what do you think? Can you whip out the cello?" And he's just game and just like kills it. So yeah.
That's awesome. Was it something that you tried on an earlier album and then you just liked the way it sounded? So every time you're working with Grant, you pull him in for some more string parts.
Yeah, I mean, I think we found a reason for every record. Well, I don't know. Maybe I don't know if we did any cello on the work. Like, I think I could be wrong about that, but if any, there can't be that much. And but there is a little bit here and there on Where Owls Know My Name, and I think there's actually the most on this one. So yeah, it was just yeah, it's like never anything huge, but it's a good layer, it's a good instrument to use. And so we know it's there for him to do, so we're like, yeah, let's use it.
In addition to the cello, this album also has some saxophone and banjo. How did that come about, and who contributed those parts?
Saxophone is like kind of the main event usually when it comes to the auxiliary instruments that we tend to use. And that came about on this record, like, because when we first started writing for this one, we were like kind of like no thanks on the saxophone. Like we kind of just were thinking like we would just do a record with no sax, just get out of the saxophone business altogether. And then it's like, then we found a spot where it would sound good, and then we found another spot and another spot, and then next thing you know, we had to call up our good friend Patrick Corona to play the sax on the record, and he's somebody that we trust and have worked with before, and we've had him out mostly live, but then hearing his original compositions on the record, I think they fit perfectly, and they have this really really cool tone to them. And banjo was done by our a friend of ours who usually does merch for us, Stefan Lopez, and he was just kind of just a brilliant banjo player. He was just kind of hanging out at the studio one day, and we were just had him bring his banjo down, and I found a couple spots for him to play on, and it's really really it. Like in his gang vocals on the album, and it's just all the dudes that were just hanging out that day. We just kind of use what's around us, which I think is a fun way to go about it.
So at the time we're having this conversation, you recently finished a tour with Cynic, and by the time people hear this episode, you guys will be, I think, in the middle of another U.S. tour.
Uh-huh.
Do you want to say anything about that tour, and maybe further tours or maybe festival appearances happening later on in the year?
Yeah. So we have this tour coming up across the United States and select cities in Canada. It's the aggressive progressive tour, as we like to call it, and it's us headlining, and we have Holy Fawn and Inter Arma and Glacial Tomb on the roster for us on every date, and I think it's going to be a great show if you appreciate heavy progressive music. It's a must attend show for this summer. Yeah, and then we have a little time off, and then we get to go to Europe for the August festival season. So we'll play a lot of these festivals over there. I'm not sure which. I know we play Bloodstock and Summer Breeze and Brutal Assault and Alcatraz, and there's a few more. There's a few more in there, but if you're going to a European festival this summer, there's a good chance you'll catch us. And then after that, we have some more going on later in the year, but I can't talk about it quite yet. So keep on the lookout.
Tell Ben from Glacial Tomb I said hi.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So by the time people hear this episode, the fifth Rivers of Nile album, called Rivers of Nile, will be out through Metal Blade Records. Adam, please tell everyone how they can order the album. What's the best way to get it?
The best way to pre-order the album would be either through the Metal Blade Records web store, or you could just go to riversofnile.com, and that has everything that we do wrapped up in it. It's got links to all of our merch stores, pre-order links, music, social media, everything right off of riversofnile.com. But yeah, other than that, if indie merch store has pre-orders for the record as well. So yeah, anywhere, pretty much anywhere that you can pre-order metal records like this is it works just fine for us. But riversofnile.com is where you want to go for everything.
And I believe there are 9 versions of the vinyl. Is that correct?
I think so. I I don't really personally have a big hand in the vinyl stuff. I looked at the list of them and I'm like, yeah, those all look cool. But yeah, there's a ton of them out there and they all do look really cool.
And you mentioned riversofnile.com. Is that the best place to go to get updates on tours or anything else you guys might be working on?
Yeah, absolutely. Everything we do is going to be on that website in some form or another. But we're always on Instagram. It's Rivers of Nile. It's on Facebook. Same thing. We're in anywhere you want to. We're just that everywhere. So yeah, keep an eye out, and we'll see. We'll see you in whatever city we get to.
Very cool. Thanks so much, Adam.
Yeah, thank you.